Here we present the environment, agriculture, and trade framework, which we generate through systems thinking. This is a causal loop diagram, which is a way of showing the relationships between different factors within a complex system. If you haven't seen one before, the arrows indicate that there is a relationship between two variables. A plus sign or a positive sign indicates a positive feedback, and this means that increases in one variable results in increases in another variable. For example, more fertilizer use results in increased yields. Whereas a minus sign or a negative sign indicates a negative feedback, which means that increases in one variable result in decreases in another. For example, more carbon sequestered result in less greenhouse gas emissions. Through this causal loop diagram, what we aim to emphasize is the important role of biodiversity. Biodiversity provides a number of important ecosystem services that benefit agriculture. These include increasing the diversity or variety of crops for food, the number of pollinators, natural pest controllers, and protection from hazards, which all provide benefits towards agriculture. However, agriculture doesn't always have positive benefits on biodiversity. For example, agricultural production can lead to increases in leached nutrients, changes to water supply, and importantly, drive the expansion and intensification of agriculture, which all have negative impacts on biodiversity. Agricultural production itself is driven by human populations, their affluence, and their demand for food. Trade is becoming a very important way that people obtain food. But increased trade agreements and increased agricultural production can have or increase the impacts on biodiversity. When we start to think about climate change and how this will affect agriculture and biodiversity, the picture becomes more complicated. For example, agricultural production contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, and greenhouse gas emissions can result in changes to climate, which will affect species distribution and ranges. And this will also affect the number of ecosystem services that species and habitats are able to provide to agricultural production. Overall, the many different connections here represent how complex our food system is, and in fact, how complex its relationships to the natural environment are. In the following slides, we simplify this figure to emphasize where more research is needed to investigate the impacts of agriculture and trade on biodiversity. In this figure, we simplify figure 1 to talk about how biodiversity interacts with agricultural production. For example, we know that biodiversity increases the number of ecosystem services that provide benefits to agricultural production. However, it also provides ecosystem disservices through pests and pathogens, which have negative impacts on agricultural production. Agroecological practices can benefit yield and biodiversity. However, overall, we find that agricultural land area and intensity of agriculture have negative impacts on biodiversity. And what we aim to emphasize here, shown by the dashed gray lines, is that we need more research to understand the feedback loop between biodiversity and agricultural production. For example, we know a lot about the impacts of agricultural production on biodiversity. And we're beginning to know more about the benefits of biodiversity in agricultural production. But we need to look at these variables as complex and interacting variables, and how changed biodiversity will affect agricultural production, or indeed how changes to agricultural production can benefit biodiversity. In this diagram, we show that when you start to think about climate and climate change, the picture becomes more complex. Agricultural production contributes to greenhouse gas emissions that contribute or cause climate change. And changes to climate, including changes in temperature and precipitation, will have impacts on biodiversity. And these are generally negative as they affect species ranges, their distribution, and the integrity of the ecosystems and habitats that species reside in. However, biodiversity, as we mentioned, provides important benefits to agricultural production and can even mitigate greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture and contribute to decreasing or preventing dangerous climate change. However, we need to understand what these feedbacks are. In a changed world where climate change is a threat to biodiversity, how will this affect the level of carbon sequestration that biodiversity can provide? How will this affect the ecosystem services that agriculture depends on? And how will this affect the intensity or the severity of climate change in the future? When we start to think about adding even more factors, including trade, trade agreements, and the demand for food and consumption, the picture starts to build in complexity. More trade agreements mean that more agricultural production is needed to meet the demand for food and provide supplies for export. And these contribute to greenhouse gas emissions and the negative impacts on biodiversity. We need to better understand how increased trade agreements affect agricultural production and how this in turn affects biodiversity. We also need to understand what other impacts trade has on biodiversity, for example, through invasive species. And we also need to think about how changed climate and climate changes will affect the number of trade agreements. Which countries will become producers? Which countries will become importers? And how will this affect biodiversity and agriculture?